Good morning to everybody. It is now 9 o'clock, Wednesday, April 9th. Welcome to this CBS Executive Foundation Executive Morning Brief. We are hosting a series of morning briefs based on our strategic theme, Tech Leadership. Tech leadership is a strategic theme of ours in response, obviously, to current tech developments and advancements, mainly AI. And based on this strategic theme, we have developed a portfolio of strategic executive leadership offerings that is designed to equip leaders with the capabilities needed to navigate tech advancements and to develop themselves as well as their businesses through digital transformation. Today, I am joined by Astrid, author, advisor, and board professional, as well as Professor Rob Gleasure from CBS, to explore how communication, leadership, and connectedness works in a world that is increasingly mediated by digital technology. I have a few brief practical notes, and then I will hand it over to you, Rob, and you, Astrid, and I'll give you a thorough introduction in a second as well. Now, in terms of practicalities, there are quite a number of us on the call. Hence, we've chosen a Zoom webinar setting that has left you muted. There will be possibility to interact. First up, through a Slido that we will show you very briefly. And secondly, as Rob and Astrid starts to debating around this topic, please do feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A function. Now, Zoom has two basically similar functions. One is called chat, the other is called Q&A. Please use the Q&A function. That is the one we are monitoring. Secondly, I have to inform you that we are recording the session and will send out the recording to all signups following the call. Now, we have asked Rob and Astrid to debate around three core questions. First being, what really happens when we communicate through digital media, and how does it affect our sense of connectedness? Secondly, how do you as a leader build trust and culture in a world mediated by digital technology? And finally, what are the business implications of digital media for inclusion, diversity, and our general well-being? Rob, you're a professor at CBS, Department of Digitalization, and co-heads our Neuro Lab, doing some very, very interesting research within the realms of collective intelligence, online communities, and basically the impact of our mood and well-being in collaborative systems. Astrid, you are a professional board member, author, and advisor. You're specializing in digital leadership and ESG communications, as well as strategic media trends, authored a number of books on these topics. Thank you both very much for joining us. We are very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this interesting topic. We'll kick off your discussion through a Slido, and hence I will ask all of you participants to please join in. We will now show you a slide. You have two ways of interacting here. Either take your phone and scan the QR code, or join slido.com with the code provided at this slide. Please answer the question on a level from 1 to 5, 5 obviously being the highest. How mature is your company's digital work culture? And we are seeing the Slido respond. Thanks so much for your responses, all of you. Now, Rob and Astrid, I will basically leave it to you. We are perhaps not too surprisingly looking at somewhere in the middle range here, perhaps to the lower side, with a tendency towards the lower side. This is a surprise to you?
Is it a super? Well, actually, I think it's probably encouraging in a way because it seems like people are very often people overestimate how far along they are when they don't understand the challenges. So you could also read this quite positively and say that people are actually really in the weeds of it, and they maybe underestimating their progress. Maybe
And
that's what
also,
we're
I mean, yeah, and you can also say, I mean, the question, what is a company's digital work culture? How do you define that, and what do you see as the end goal? What would be a five in this? So as Rob mentions, it can also be because people have bigger ambitions. And I think also we don't see that many who are like on level one, which would be like we're still struggling to get Zoom and Teams to work maybe. So because of Corona and because of the high level of digitalization in Denmark overall, I think we find people being somewhat mature, but also there's more to be done. And actually, and that's also why I think this question is interesting. I don't meet that many companies who have what you can say like a specific digital culture. So a lot of companies, they talk about the culture and work motivation and the well-being of the employees, but not very often do they actually put into words and maybe even into a policy what is our digital work culture. It is somehow just something we add to the real work culture, which is still very much dependent on the physical work culture. So I think also that's really good why you bring this topic, because we really still need to discuss what is a good digital work culture. It's not just, oh, okay, then the people who are not in the office, that they can join by Zoom. It has to be more than that.
Great. Thanks so much for those initial remarks. Again, we have provided you guys with 3 questions. The first one is, what really happens when we communicate through digital media, and how does that affect our sense of connectedness?
Do you want to kick off, Rob?
Sure. Yes, happy to. Okay. So I think that there are sort of two major differences when we talk about sort of communicating through digital media. Um, so the first one, so when we communicate, very often we're communicating two things. We're communicating information and we're sort of communicating how we feel, right? And that's important because how we feel kind of emotions are a call to action, right? So it kind of says how we're going to act on all of this in different information available to us. I actually think with digital media, we're pretty good at communicating the information side and what we're thinking, but we're pretty bad at communicating how we're feeling. And there's a bunch of different anecdotes on this as well, where people share information quite effectively, but it turns out they're going down a road none of them are that happy about. They just don't know how to communicate that they're not very happy about this. And one of the reasons I think we struggle to communicate how we feel is that a lot of the ways we communicate how we feel are very subtle and very physical. So sometimes people can use words to describe how they feel. I'm excited this, or I'm worried this other thing or something. Sometimes it's facial expressions and posture and gestures and these things. But also when people are in a room together, a lot of strange things happen. You know, heart rates start to synchronize and people have hormonal changes that synchronize with each other. There's even been evidence that shows that there's unconscious odor perception that helps us actually figure out how all of us are feeling and helps us sort of find that sort of emotional contagion so that we can have this sort of baseline of empathy. So I think sometimes we sort of lose that. The other thing, which I think is complicated when we talk about digital media, is that we tend to have a lot more connections, and often they're shallower connections, or they're connections with people in different groups that don't overlap. And sometimes that can be tricky because we're a slightly different version of ourselves in all of these different groups. And when the groups don't overlap, we can kind of feel a little bit more like a stranger in each of these individual groups if none of them are particularly prominent. So yeah, I think those are two things. It's partly that I think it can make us feel a little bit less connected. Sometimes it can also make us feel a little bit less almost motivated to feel connected because we don't have the natural things pulling us towards each other in terms of empathy. So yeah, sorry, Astrid.
No, that's very interesting, Rob, and I think I agree with all the things you said. It's really hard to not agree with a professor, of course. But for the sake of this thing, I would also try to challenge your argument a little bit, because I think sometimes also at physical meetings, and I think most of us being here today, of course, we somewhat would prefer physical meetings, but then again, just making this webinar is so much easier that we don't all have to transport back and forth and so on. And maybe you can even join from afar and so on. And I sometimes think actually at a physical meeting there can be too many cues, so there can be too many smells. If that's one of the things you like, Rob, I don't enjoy it as much. There could be too many noises. There could be too many people, not sitting still. I'm just saying there could be so many cues. And as people, we are very, we take in a lot of cues, and we also somewhat judgmental. So different reports also shows, we evaluate or assess people based on their looks, on their clothes, on their shoes, on their watch, on their hairstyle, all these kind of things we take in, and we make assumptions about people that might not be very true. So I'm just saying that sometimes all these cues, and also I know it's also like, from leadership perspective, we should, this person looked a bit sad, and this person, I mean, sometimes I think we read too much into it, to be honest. And I also, so I think sometimes that's the problem. And also I like the idea that we're kind of like adjusting each other's heart rates and so on. But I also see the potential for consensus bias. And we also have that in digital meetings, because I think you're right. Sometimes in digital meetings, it can actually be harder to speak up, because this kind of disagreement can be really hard actually to have on a digital meeting. But I'm just saying some of the things we somehow like to have in the physical workspace might not be an advantage to everybody. And one of the things I found also with the digital meetings and so on is that the hierarchy is somewhat challenged. So and we saw that during Corona. So sometimes the CEO or maybe the board chair or whoever was kind of in charge was the one who might not be as good at all these digital tools as some of the other people, typically a bit younger people, to be honest. So sometimes you just see that the hierarchy when we go digital shifts, and that's also why I was just digging into some of the newer reports and so on this before the meeting. And we still see that most bosses or CEOs, leaders, they prefer physical work. So actually more companies, especially in the US, and I think also we can get back to the difference between the US and Denmark in many ways, but some companies like Amazon, Tesla, Dell, and others, they are actually saying people can no longer work remote. And even Deloitte in the US, they said that it will be part of your bonus if you meet physically instead of being working from remote. So we see that the bosses and leaders, they really prefer the physical workspace, and I think that's a huge problem, because if at the same time you want to encourage digital innovation and being like a digital company, I mean, you're sending the wrong signals by saying, oh, by the way, everybody has to be here physically all the time.
Yeah, and I think you're right. There's a few things there that I think I completely agree with. Like the idea of sort of actually we can be hyper connected, a bit too connected sometimes, and that as well as it just being stressful, it can lead to things like groupthink, right? If we're accidentally picking up on all of these different cues with each other and things feel so easy, that might be a sign that we're not actually thinking very clearly at all, right? We might focus too much on how we're feeling. And I think another point there as well is it can be hard to be different, right, in these sort of places as well, where everyone is operating very similarly. Whereas when people have more digital spaces and they are able to kind of choose where they spend their time a little bit more in terms of these things, there is in some ways a way to be less isolated, right? Because you can sort of you can focus more on sort of the digital areas and groups and things where you find it easier, right? So I think all of these are very good points. What seems to be the trend within each of this, what seems to be the coming through the center, is that actually neither is really better, and that it's probably hard to do just one of them, right? Because you gain something and you lose something either way. And I think that is the threat with places like Deloitte that you're talking about, where they're saying, well, you have to be in the office. How much? Like, what's the sweet spot? Because I don't think we have a very good answer for that. A bit, at least, seems to be the thing. But also the opportunity to be away a bit also seems important for the same sort of reasons.
I came across an expression and I kind of had it in my mind. I heard about it, but I had to look it up on some chatbot. But the expression called management by walking around, or management by wandering around. And I just looked into it. It's like it derived from the 1970s. And I just think that we still see some leaders who think, oh, I'm just walking around and see how people feel, and how is the mood, and you know, where can I be helpful, and so on. And many years ago, when I used to have like a real job before I became self-employed, I also remember having these bosses who just like wandering around, and then they kind of got an idea about how the mood was. But I mean, you can also really easy fake it towards your boss if you're not in a good mood. So the idea that that's how you manage people is just very old school to me. But I really believe that it's still very dominant out there, or at least the mindset of, if I can see people either how they're doing, mood-based, or also, of course, if I can see them in the office, then they're productive. And if I can't see them, then they're not. Okay, I think one of the big difference between also the development we see in the States compared to Denmark, where most companies, they do allow some kind of remote work if it's possible, is the level of trust. So I think in Denmark we have a really trust-based and also low hierarchy kind of culture, which can also sometimes be a bit confusing, because then again, what is required of me, and how much should I actually work if it's more flexible, and so on. But I really believe that the trust is very important here. And then also, of course, then how do you build trust online or digitally? How do you have like a trust-based digital culture? And I think maybe you can, I don't know if that's a clue for you, Rob.
No, but it's interesting. So I think the walk around leadership's a really good point. It seems to me that there are sort of two different approaches to the walk around leadership. There's the one where people walk around almost to energize people, right? So it's like they have a way they want people to be working, and they sort of walk around to just sort of top people up in work culture. Like they're the source of culture, and they walk around topping people up and sort of keeping the thing humming, like a engineer walking around just tightening bolts all the time, right? But there is another one where people walk around for sensitivity, because they walk around because they want to see how somebody's work. Are they all right? Like, what's happening over here? People in this department seem quite stressed. What's going on? Nobody's said why, but you can feel it, right? That there's something wrong here. And I think actually that type of walk around leadership probably still has a place, because I don't think we have a good digital version of that yet, right? We don't have a way to just walk around and just get a vibe in the same sort of way. But I think it's really interesting then of, that's fine, but how do we do it, right? How do we bring those things together? And I think you're right. In Denmark, because a lot of leadership is quite adaptive, right? Where people assume people working for them are smart, and they try and help them and nudge them forward, and they're not necessarily running forward and saying, hey, everyone, come follow me to this place. I actually think that sort of sensitivity style is one of the reasons why I think we would miss it less if we were more hierarchical. That sort of walking around to sense things, but we're less hierarchical. So I think for a lot of people, it's still very important. I think there seem to be a few ways in terms of how we can go digital and sort of keep that. There seem to be a few different sort of options that are out there. As we mentioned, one of the things is just physical gatherings from at least time to time, right? So you don't need to see everyone every day, but you need to see people sometimes. And I think what we're seeing a lot as well, and I don't know if this is your experience too, is that people try to be in, for example, the office at the same time. So it's not that someone comes on Monday, someone comes on Fridays. There's kind of days when people come, because then everyone's there and they sort of come together, and then they can distribute again. So that seems to be nice. I think as well, one of the things that we're not as good at yet in digital, in terms of digital workplaces, is sort of common spaces. You know, the way in a lot of offices, you have sort of places where people will go. They'll get a coffee, or they'll sit somewhere. There's something where they're kind of just in the same space. And of course, our spaces affect us as well, right? I'm not sure we ever figured that out when we went digital. I mean, I think a lot of places tried to do sort of virtual coffees. Hey, everyone can come along and join at a particular time. I don't know. Did you see that working much, or did you see any good, strong versions of it?
No, that's a really good question, actually. And I think also in a lot of places, they have also gone back to like the physical office, that people still have, you know, their own spot and so on. Digitally, I think it's more like then you use tools like Slack, or you have it maybe in your Microsoft Office. I just forgot the name of it. Yammer, I think. Yeah, some people use where it's like kind of a digital version of this. But I agree with you. The kind of like serendipity where you like, oh, you bump into Rob by the coffee machine, and oh, I'm working on this, and so on. It's definitely more difficult digitally, and you really need people to chip in and say, oh, I'm working on this and I'm working on that. And at the same time, one of the advantages people report from working from home or remote work is they don't get disturbed as much.
Yes.
And if you have to check into Slack every now and then, you really do get disturbed throughout your work day. So it's definitely difficult. I think what some companies do, at least, is very practical. So they have like a team, like a meeting in the team online, and then everybody chip in. So what are you working on? But you really, as a leader, have to be more systemized about it. And I also think the work culture we have physically has taken over 100 years to develop. So in that regard, we have really had to speed it up in a very few years. And also what we have seen in the last couple of years with Corona and so on it has been this negotiation going back and forth between the leaders and the employees. And I think that's very interesting perspective. It's very much also just like good old supply and demand. So right now in Denmark, there is a very low level of unemployment. So as an employee, as a group, of course, but also if you are in high demand, as we see in the tech industry, you can say what you want to have. So you could say, okay, I want to work from home 4 days a week, or maybe even 5 days a week. And if you're in high demand, of course, you can put those kind of demands out there. And then in other times when you have, maybe as we see right now in the States, maybe people getting laid off and so on, then the employees or the employer, can actually say you need to be in the office all the time. So this negotiation also, should there be some days where everybody has to be there, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and how flexible should it be? And I think, of course, it's very different from workplace to workplace. It's also different if you're a lawyer, if you work in the municipality. And of course, if you're a policeman or if you're a teacher, I mean, you don't even have that kind of flexibility at all. And we should also bear that in mind. But I just think it's really interesting to see how this negotiation has been going on, and is still going on at some workplaces, and also between the employees, because some people really prefer to be in the office, and some people prefer to be remote, or at least have the flexibility. So my sister, she's working at the municipality, and we're very much alike, but also very different. She really likes to come into the office, and she likes being surrounded by coworkers. I really love to being at home and just work by myself as much as possible. So people are also very different, and I think as a leader, that is one of the biggest problems, because you really need to find the balance between different kinds of interest in this regard.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. It's also interesting, and I think it leads on to a hidden tension a little bit in the sort of the digital work culture. So you mentioned that people kind of like to work at home because they don't get disturbed or interrupted as much. So actually, one of the things that has come to light through a bunch of different sort of case studies is that when people are physically close, like when they're in the same office, there are a lot of subtle cues that they give, that they basically say, if you have a small question to ask me, now's a good time. Like, it might be the door open, it might be people sitting back in their desk, it might be people daydreaming, but it becomes quite intuitive when is a time when you can just ask somebody a very simple little question, where it might, it'll save you 20 minutes and you can talk to them for 5 seconds, hey, have you seen that thing somewhere, or something like that. When we're online, we don't see that in the same. I know people have like the green light, orange light, red light thing, but I don't necessarily think everybody uses that consistently. And it's also, if you put your available thing on, I think a lot of people are slow to do that because they feel like they're just inviting so much, right? So that's kind of interesting, because it's harder to know when is a good time to interrupt people with these micro interruptions. So we tend to just not do these micro interruptions, which can often mean we spend a lot of time on small things where we think, if I'd been next door to someone else, they probably could have actually helped me do this much, much faster. Right? And I think that the tension that leads on to is there's sort of a long-standing distinction between when you manage, do you manage behaviors or do you manage outcomes? Do you give people deliverables where you say you've got to hit these things at this time to these standards? Or do you tell people how they have to work? You need to be here at these times and these things. And you really can't do both. That's like too controlling. You can't tell people how to work and the outcomes that they're going to achieve. That's very sort of Taylorist and factory line-ish. So people tend to veer one way or the other a little bit. And some of the agile teams have gone more sort of behavioral of, we're here at this time, we meet at this time, so you go do these things. We're not necessarily going to keep track of everything that you do all along. We're going to assume that you're doing good work. We're just going to get into good habits. And then a lot of other places, like in the universities, we're quite lucky. We have a lot of outcome controls where nobody tells us how to work or really checks in, but they have things that we need to hit. And if we don't hit those, then people will come and tell us how to work. And I think this is, the distinction that we make. I think the loss of that ability to do these micro interruptions actually calls for more behavioral controls in the digital space so that we can see when are other people working, when are other people taking their coffee, when is a good time to talk to each other about that. But our natural tendency has actually been to go digital and to go outcome based, which kind of exacerbates the problem. As the worker, we love it, right? We're just left alone. You can be at home, do your work whenever you want, right? That's fantastic. But we're dialing up this tension more and more as we go. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does, and I think I saw it a bit differently, but I'm listening and trying to adjust my own thoughts around this, because also what you're saying, if it's only output based, I mean, there's kind of like no limit also to your work time, and we also see that. Like when people are, vacationing, they're still on their emails and so on. And I think definitely that's a problem. I think in France, they're really good to have these kind of laws saying you're not allowed to send emails after 5 p.m. and you're not allowed to, I don't remember, but something like you're not allowed to check emails during vacation. And maybe that's a bit too strict, but I really do see that it's difficult also. I mean, I'm self-employed, and when are you working, when are you not working? That is actually more difficult. But also, Rob, I'm thinking that a lot of companies and most companies in Denmark, but also around the world, are digital companies. You also have companies who are working across locations, working across borders, international companies. And I think the recent number I found was that about 40% of the Danish workforce actually work from home. I was in the end of 2024. So it's a rather substantial part of the workforce. So knowing that some of the working processes and so on are better in the physical, what is your recommendation to then improve this kind of digital working environment as well?
Well, I think rediscovering those rhythms at least a little bit probably has to be part of it. And I think forbidding people to answer emails after 5 o'clock is actually a sort of, because you're pushing the work back into the work hours as well, right? So it has an advantage because you say, go spend time with your family or your hobbies or whatever, and that's wonderful. But you're also saying that implicitly that you should be replying within work days, right? So you sort of push these things back. So I think there's a degree of readjustment back to saying, yeah, we're all going to work remotely, but we're going to have some sort of rhythms that tie us together at least a little bit so that we're working at the same times. I think that's probably required a little bit. There are, of course, sort of technological solutions on these things as well. One of the things that we're starting to see more is people experimenting with things like showing heart rates and stuff. Going back to some of the things we're talking about at the start, you might have seen this. I was watching chess on YouTube recently, and they show heart rate of the people playing because it helps to actually understand. But if you were in the room with them, you would feel it, right? You'd feel the stress, but you don't see it as much on the screen. So they've started doing these little things, and then when you see it, you feel like, oh, you see the jump and you feel it on the other side of it. So I think people have experimented as well in organizations with these things of capturing pieces of data like that, and sort of so that teams can work together in different ways. There's a huge number of dangers in terms of what happens when you start gathering that data on people. But I just mean that there's somewhere down the line, there's probably technological solutions to this as well. But in the meantime, I think small things like rediscovering these rhythms. I think these sort of gatherings that are sort of timed as well within these rhythms to bring people back together at the same time, so that if you are going to meet physically, at least you get the best possible time out of it. I think we're sort of stuck a little bit as well in this backwards and forwards because, and maybe leading on to our third question, it's not just that some people choose to work from home, it's that some people have to work from home. right? So this 40% of the workforce, if you said, hey, everyone back to the office, some of them would just say, I can't do that. I just can't do that for a variety of different reasons. And it's been an interesting journey, I think, in terms of inclusion. And I know we talked about it before, like people with disabilities, people who are not neurotypical. You know, there's a lot of different people who've kind of found different ways to work that might help, but also might hinder their performance and their ability to sort of feel comfortable and to create value in an organization. And I know you have strong feelings about that as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad you're moving forward to the inclusiveness part. And I think also that can go both ways, of course, because as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, we see that people are still awarded for being physical, and you know, it's still, if you're working late and you're there before the boss and you're there after she leaves and so on. I mean, you will be rewarded one way or the other, typically, and then we have some very modern bosses who can see up beyond that, but that is still like the dominant work culture. And I think one of the things that was a bit surprising for me, at least during Corona and after, was actually that a lot of young people wanted to go into the office, mostly also because if you don't have a partner and you don't have kids and so on, it can be actually quite lonely to be at home. First of all, you might have a very small place, you might live, with other people or and so on. And also, if you're young in the workforce, you really need your peers to tell you what to do and give you some clues as to what is required here and so on. Whereas older people and more established people, they could see the benefits, and especially people with kids. You don't have the transport. You can actually be a bit more home, maybe take a small break. So I work from home sometimes, and also have 3 kids, and maybe they come home. I can have a small talk. I go back and so on. It really gives a huge flexibility for family life and so on. And then also I think, and that's also what I think maybe I addressed in the beginning, there can be too many clues if you go into a workplace. And I also remember being at a newspaper, sitting in the newsroom, where all the things happening, but it's just like too noisy to be able to think 2 thoughts ahead. And also some people don't like to talk in a big meeting and so on. So I think and especially as we see more and more young people, but of course also older people getting diagnosis and so on, becoming more advanced in our understanding of each other and how we perceive the world. I think we need to be more inclusive. So finding the good way to say, okay, we need, of course, to include all people in the workforce, but we also need to include those who are working remote, so that working remote is not like secondary to the physical place. And I think, you can do some easy things around it, having, more meetings with them and so on, but also just the way you address it and the way you talk about it and the way you, put together your bonuses and what you have is very important. So, yeah.
Sorry for forcing my way back into the meeting again. Thank you very much for that very interesting conversation. My first sort of reflection personally is that we haven't really found textual. It's very much who you're talking with and what sort of setting you're speaking. But we do see sort of challenges on both the physical as well as the digital side to a large extent. We have a lot of good questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much for that. The first one I'm going to take is from Søren. Thank you, Søren. Talking to that sort of, again, the flexibility and the wide variety of opportunities that digital space provides, not least when you're working across geographies and time zones, that sort of stuff. But I think, as Søren rightly pointed out, that very often also leads to this sort of back-to-back meeting culture, because it's possible. Is the sort of digital meeting culture or the options, are they fueling an unhealthy back-to-back meeting culture in your opinion? And if so, how do you navigate that as a leader?
I think it's definitely something you need to be aware of. So if you as a leader see, okay, my calendar is booked from Monday to Friday with meetings. Maybe it's the same for my employees. What is our culture around having meetings? And everybody needs some I was about to say free time, but some focus time. Where you don't have meetings. So there's this really good book about this topic called Why It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at the Office, or Why It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work. And one of the things they talk about is the M&Ms that are disturbing. So it's the meetings and managers. So it's the managers that keep disturbing, and it's the meetings that take up all your time. So for me, in my daily work life, I really try to limit the amount of meetings. And I can do that because I'm self-employed, but I also think at the workforce, if you feel you have too many meetings, I think definitely something you should address. It's probably an overall thing. And then again, you can have people who think being in meeting is really good because that's how they get things done. But then you need to address that you really need this free time. And also I find that in some work cultures, it's not appropriate that you just, sit and read an article or you sit and do some research because you have to be busy. So this whole busyness is, to be honest, it's just driving me crazy. Like every time you meet people, oh, I'm so busy. I'm like, I'm really trying not to be busy because, that's not how I want to live my life, and that's not how I want to do my work. So I think taking this whole business that we need to be in meetings, I think it can be done. You can have shorter meetings, and you can also actually, and then again, if you work in different time zones, I'm a huge a fan of having a more written culture. And now with AI and so on, more stuff can get written, and you can also have it read aloud to you and so on. So see, can you write it down, and then again, can it wait? Everything doesn't have to be answered within the minute or within the hour. You can maybe wait a few hours before actually you get your answers. So having a culture, and then that is really the leader who sets the standard here. So if the leader says, oh, you can just take a break and so on, but this leader is sending emails Sunday morning and so on, you know that's the culture that this leader has. So I think that's actually one of the most important things you can do as a leader, saying it's okay that things sometimes takes time to get answered. And then, of course, if it's super important and super urgent, you will call somebody up and say, hey, I really need your help right now. But what I found mostly, both from being in a work culture and now as a consultant, most of the things are not that important. I mean, are some people dying here, or are we losing millions of dollars? If not, then I think it can wait for a few hours at least. So having this kind of a bit more relaxed work culture, and also that you're allowed to saying, oh, I'm not going to join this meeting because I really have some important stuff that I need to get done. I need to write this thing, or I need to do this research.
Any reflections, Rob?
Yeah, like I think there's a couple of things. So, I mean, partly I think there's a lot of meetings because we're less efficient when we communicate with each other online. So I think there's a little bit of it is that as well. And then I think there's a couple of other things which are it's funny the way our tools sometimes influence us. Like, I think if you have meeting rooms in your office, there's a sense that you can't be using the meeting rooms all the time. It's a finite resource. And actually, in some ways, I think that acted to control the number of meetings, right? You couldn't be in meetings all the time because if everyone was in meetings all the time, there wasn't space. So I think somehow that we were forced to prioritize in these little ways. Yeah, and I think that's probably important. The other thing, which I think adds to your point about the culture side of this as well, Astrid, is there's a sense that if you're not in a meeting, you're free. Right. And that's become the vocabulary as well, very much, that I'm free from these times. Well, I'm not, I'm working. I'm doing something. Like putting a meeting in there is not it's not that I'm free. I'm not just, I don't know, throwing a frisbee in the garden and I'll come in and do a meeting, right? So I think part of it as well is getting away from that idea that if you're not in a meeting, you're free. I think that's actually just a conceptual shift. And I think another thing as well, which we've been much better at in person, is we tend to have very short physical meetings. We're very good at that. Whereas you block something in the calendar and you're like, well, we have 30 minutes for this meeting. If we're done after 2 minutes, do we need to, like, you're naturally inclined to stay on because you've sort of booked it. Whereas I feel a little bit we're better in person, where we go, we meet, we talk about something. You can see the cues from everybody's kind of shuffling their papers together or whatever, and you're out the door. So I think some of it's cultural, some of it is our tools tricking us a little bit that we need to push back on.
Cool. So basically, I mean, in the digital space, you have the flexibility, but that's also leads to sort of a limitlessness that we, to some extent, have to control or put boundaries around as leaders. I'm hearing you say,
Yes.
whereas the physical sort of setting is less flexible, for sure.
Yes.
Especially obviously when we work across geographies, that sort of stuff. But this sort of the limitations on work and the behavioral control is more implicit here.
Yes.
So how do I get started with sort of, as a leader, establishing, and this is a question as well, how do I get started with establishing work politics that allows for these sort of both diverse needs, but also leverages the potential in both spaces?
So I think it would be good if you have some kind of description around your culture. You have some values. You can probably, like, you know, in the leadership team or maybe with your team of employees, say, okay, so how is our work culture? How do we define it? What is a good day of work? All this kind of culture work that is really important to keep doing. Maybe you did it like 5-10 years ago, but you have new employees now and so on. And then also transform that and say, okay, so we have this, and I think for most people and leaders, it's easiest to do with the physical workspace first, and then say, okay, with these values we established for the company and for our culture and how we work together, how do we translate that into the digital space? And I think you have at least three things and probably more, but I mean, what channels do we have? So just like be super aware of what are the channels we communicate in online. So we have the meetings, we have the emails, we have the text messages, we might have social media, but being very clear, what do we use these different challenge for? And also maybe some people think that an email is more formal than others. So just being aware that there might be different perceptions of these channels. And also the time. So when are different people working, and is it okay that you don't, you know, start working until 11 in the morning? Just having this discussion about it. And then the tone is the last thing. Because sometimes you also see that, you know, you have maybe a leader that writes really short and you know, you get the idea that the leader is too busy to be polite, or you know, is too productive, sending too many emails, just like, you know, sending them out there, and also being like too needy, you need to reply now. So what is our digital work culture? How long can things wait, and so on? I really think you should have a good discussion around this, and you will find out that people see these things very differently because we probably never really talked about it.
What do you think, Rob?
I agree completely. So I think the channels for sure. I think sometimes it's also useful to think about them as spaces rather than just channels, because people do spend time in them, and a lot of the time there are characteristics of them where it's not just the information, it's the whole context kind of adds something to it. I think managing those very, very carefully and being sort of conscious of them and what the pros and cons and what they're doing to people. Again, I think events, are really important when you have people who are more distributed, being really clever about how you bring people together, because that's the chance to really sort of put an imprint, which will sort of play out until the next event in many cases. And then, yes, I think the rhythms, I think, as you say, when people are working, how they're working, just some sense as to how we tend to operate. We don't have to be sort of completely dictatorial in terms of telling people how to work. But sometimes it is just saying, if you're sending an email in the morning, just schedule it to send at 9. Don't actually send it, right? These little things which just kind of collapse back and sort of cause us to then hopefully work at sort of similar times, or at least collaborate and coordinate with each other at similar times, I think are great. Yeah, I'm not sure there's a silver bullet as such in yet. I think one of the other things which people probably need to be conscious of is small signals of information can become very powerful in the absence of a lot of different cues and a lot of different things. So sometimes things like hires and promotions as well, you need to be very conscious of, like you mentioned, there's a sense that people are being promoted or they're getting bonuses for time in the office. I mean, if they are, that needs to be clearly communicated. And if they're not, that needs to be clearly communicated, because I think a lot of the time, again, it's not just being fair, it's being perceived to be fair. And it's not just having values, it's being perceived to have these values as well. So I think there's something in that as well about being very just sensitive and clever in terms of what you're actually doing with all of these little decisions.
Can I just shortly
Very short, please, Astrid, but yes, feel free.
Okay, very shortly. I think it's also about having this discussion so we can be respectful of the differences, but also as a leader being very clear what is up for negotiation and what is actually the established work culture we have here that not everybody might fit into without being too rigid about it.
Thank you both very much. And sort of the overall takeaway here is that I don't think this conversation is going to go away anytime in the near future. It's something that you as a leader will have to be conscious of how you navigate. I have a final outro slide, but first up, thank you very much, Rob. Thank you very much, Astrid. Much appreciated and very interesting points throughout the morning. We are looking to leave all of you participants here within 30 seconds. I will just have to, this outro slide providing an overview of the 2025 tech leadership portfolio from us here at CBS Executive Foundation. We'll send out the slides as well as the recording after the session here. I do encourage you to take a look at what's on our menu for the second half of 2025. Thank you to all participants, particularly you, Astrid, and you, Rob.
Bye.
Have a splendid Wednesday, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.